have a preconceived view about diet and health, right? If you already have come to a conclusion about what you think the best diet is, whether that's vegan or whether that's low carb, you can build a case in favor of that. It doesn't mean it's a very good case or a very strong case, but you can build, and that's why there's so much confusion, certainly in the public, with nutrition, because honestly, you can argue nearly any position. It's just a question of whether that position actually has any evidential weight and integrity to it. But that involves then knowing enough about the research to be able to pick apart why it might or might not hold for what the claim actually is. And then I think, even though it's often adjusted for, I think that there's still the contribution of high animal fat generally, and saturated fat in particular, to cardiovascular disease, which is something we do know. So I don't think it's TMAO, but I do think there are other mechanisms by which high, unprocessed meat consumption could still contribute to increased risk, and it relates to, heme, nitrates, nitrites, saturated fat, animal fat generally, and potentially, and again, exacerbated by the absence or low intakes of vegetables and fruit and fiber and all that good stuff.
Kia ora, friends. Welcome back. I know it's been a bit of time. We've had a little bit of a hiatus on the Vegan Body Coach podcast. We'll just call this Season 2, Part 2, okay? We're back into it. We've got a whole bunch of great episodes coming up, and today is going to be an absolute banger for you. For anyone hanging out here for the first time, my name is Jackson Burden. I'm the host. I am a personal trainer, nutrition coach, and gym owner here in Auckland, New Zealand. And this podcast is all about bringing together like-minded people, interviewing experts, athletes, researchers in their respective fields, and putting out some really good quality information for you to take away and implement in your own lifestyle. Today, I've got none other than Alan Flanagan. And if you don't know who Alan is a PhD candidate in nutrition at University of Surrey, and he's also got a master's in nutritional medicine. He's the founder of Alinea Nutrition, where he delivers evidence-based analysis of key issues in nutrition science, and also he's the research communication officer over at Sigma Nutrition, which is run by Danny Lennon, host of Sigma Nutrition Radio, who we've had on the podcast previously. Now, Alan is one of the smartest guys I've had the pleasure of talking to, a very rational guy, and has an incredible grip on the research, specifically on nutritional science. And I wanted to get him on today to discuss what the data actually says on meat and human health and any animal product in human health. I think as the general population, we have a hard time separating the moral and ethical implications of consumption of animal products from the objective assessment of the evidence from a human health perspective. The health effects should be considered independently of the moral and ethical and environmental implications. And then we can discuss the considerations for the dosage or the potential exclusion of those animal products. But I think when we get into trouble is where we start to regurgitate information from the latest New York Times bestseller or, the big MD plant-based hotshot that you're getting your information from, without looking at it probably from a more nuanced perspective, and realizing that there's very, very few black and whites in nutritional science. And as you'll listen to in this discussion, just as a disclaimer, this is going to be quite an in-depth look at the various animal products. For example, we cover red meat, processed meat, unprocessed meat. We cover some chicken. We cover dairy and the nuances of, different types of dairy, cheese, butter, yogurt. We also touch on fish and omega-3s, and a little bit of insight into leucine, protein, and the effects on IGF-1. And it is a pretty deep dive. There's some pretty sciencey bits, so just hang in there with me until the end, and I'll come back around and we'll do a bit of a recap for you and hopefully try and summarize some of the main points. So don't fret if you feel like you're getting lost throughout this episode. But all that to say, this is not an episode that is trying to discount your reasons for excluding animal products. and I'm completely aware of the huge benefits to animal welfare, the ethical and moral components of that, and of course the huge benefits to reductions in global greenhouse emissions from our reduction in animal products. More so, this episode is just trying to encourage all of us to think a little bit more critically about these topics, especially when it comes to the access of nutritional adequacy around the world and blanket statements of saying that the world needs to be plant-based or the world needs to be vegan. Because in reality, there are many populations around the world, populations that won't be listening to this podcast right now, that are reliant on certain animal products to achieve nutritional adequacy for their communities. And we can't rule that out. So when we look at nutritional science, I think it's important to have a lot more of a nuanced view, and to have someone like Alan come in and paint the picture that, yeah, there are some animal products that may increase risks of different types of cancers or cardiovascular disease, but there are other animal products that are potentially beneficial for human health as well. So like I said, guys, it's a pretty in-depth one. Take your time, get through it, and I'll meet you on the other side for a recap, and we'll see if we can summarize this thing. This is episode 31 with Alan Flanagan. You are listening to the Vegan Body Coach podcast, all about optimizing your strength, fitness, and physique through a plant-focused diet. My name is Jackson Burton, and I'm a nutrition and training coach for vegans, the plant-centric, and plant-curious. I'm sitting down with athletes, experts, and influencers around the world to inspire you to create your best vegan body yet. Alrighty, so Alan, thank you so much for jumping on the Vegan Body Coach podcast. It has been a long time coming, but we're here now, and it's a real honor to have you on. For the listeners, really quick, did you want to give a little background as to who you are, what you do, how do you spend your days at the moment, and I guess where you're at in the world, and how COVID's been affecting how you sort of do life?
Yeah, so I've been in London, basically England, the UK, for pretty much the entire time. But as people may tell from the accent, I'm not from the UK originally, Irish originally. And I have come to nutrition and research in a fairly roundabout way. So I'm one of those people who didn't think that science was something I was into. I was a kind of humanities student, like history, English, languages, and did that in college, and then went into law. Did a law degree after. My undergrad was history and English, and then I spent 10 years practicing as a barrister in Dublin.
Wow.
But in that time frame and in this background, I was always really interested in nutrition, largely for my own reasons, like playing rugby in school and all this kind of stuff, looking for the extra edge to make like an average player better, and it didn't, but
Yeah, didn't quite
so right, you kind of realize like that's where nutrition's really limited. You're either good at a sport or you're not, or you're okay at it. So but yeah, I was really fascinated by I think that maybe the benefit of being in law is you're constantly trained and honed to think about evidence. Where does your evidence come from? So I kind of found myself becoming a bit of a PubMed warrior in my mid-teens or in my mid-20s, and reading papers, and very quickly realized like I didn't have a clue what I was doing and reading. So I started looking for some kind of formal education, and ultimately through some kind of serendipitous interactions, I had a friend who had got on ahead of me to a master's in the UK at the University of Surrey. So I kind of applied, and they unofficially were happy to kind of let in a couple of people every year that aren't from like a biosciences background. So I was fortunate enough. They were kind of like, oh, this is strange. You're a lawyer, but this is interesting. And I kind of at the time, we'll let you in. We've no expectations. And
yes.
And the rest really is kind of history. I really took to the science of nutrition. I'm not really that interested in the food side, the arguments we have about food. The reason I fell in love with nutrition as a science is because of like the methodology, the complexities, and the nuance within the evidence. So, whether we're talking about eggs, tofu, chickpeas, or chicken, like I don't really care about that stuff as much. I don't have a vested interest in the food part. I'm obsessed with method and methodology, and I fell in love with nutrition for all of the complexity and nuance of that. And then, I got to the end of my MSc, and an opportunity for a full-time PhD came up in a project that was really cool. We were doing a controlled like laboratory experiment in humans, and I was like, I can't pass this up. So I made the switch full-time, and that was 3 years ago. And then in the meantime, I've set up my own website, and I've started working with Sigma Nutrition, and things are good. So lockdown was productive, but also I'm kind of happy for pubs to reopen and the sun's coming out here. So
yeah. I think you guys are in a good space right now with everything reopening over there. So I'm sure you'll be enjoying a few pints.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, listeners will know Danny, who I've had on the podcast, and sort of his take on how he, looks at the evidence and a very rational mindset, which I love and I really appreciate. And it's the same with you and listening to the Sigma statements or reading the Sigma statements and listening to discussions within the Sigma Nutrition Radio podcast. It's this level of nuance that's often missed in a short Instagram post, where you, like you're saying, there's so many intricacies to science and specifically nutrition science. And I think for the average person, reading a paper is an absolute nightmare. It's just gibberish. And even for me, I can get through a paper and read it to some level of understanding. But even for myself, I much prefer to read a research review, for example, so I can see someone else's take on it, have them kind of break it down a little bit easier for me to understand, and then kind of be able to implement that and dissect that and then distribute it out to whoever I'm posting to. So I guess with yourself and how we look at the topic of nutrition, especially around plant-based nutrition, where do you see how we are looking at data currently and how potentially we're going wrong and how we're looking at data? Because I think, with a lot of the plant-based community, we have a lot of, I guess what I would say is there's big shot MDs out there that'll put out a specific opinion on some data, and then that will get regurgitated over and over again until it just becomes common speak within the plant-based community.
Right.
And then everyone's just agreeing on the same thing, but then there are rebuttals to that are kind of getting pushed aside, and then it just becomes this like all-knowing idea about nutrition. So where do you think we're going wrong in that sense?
Yes. So it's something that and we can see. I think what I'm about to describe, what I think is going on, play out with other areas of nutrition. As an example, the kind of health at every size movement. And what it is, in my opinion, is that evidence and activism don't particularly mix very well together. And it's very, as an activist, it's all about the outcome and wanting other people to join you in adopting this particular position. And as a result, we get into various kind of motivated reasoning and approaches that are less based on kind of intellectual rigor and integrity and in analyzing and investigating a position, and more about this is what I believe, and I will work backwards to uphold this belief with scaffolding. And that scaffolding tends to be, here's a study that shows X, and here's a study that shows Y. And that's really not how we make decisions in science. We make decisions from a total body of evidence. And within that, we look for different converging lines of evidence from different types of study, because no one study is going to answer every question. And so what I think kind of happened, and really, if you look at particularly those MDs in the plant-based vegan community, they seem largely to be in the US. in the UK, there's been kind of, on the flip side, most of the kind of quack doctors here are all low carb keto
Yes.
crazies, and you know, and so it's been. I've wondered, like, why is there this kind of transatlantic divide in terms of where the MDs, what camp they pitted themselves into. But I think what it is, you know, the first is the incredible authority bias that comes with being a healthcare professional, but specifically medical professionals carry a huge amount of weight in terms of authority and perceived authority. The second is that nutrition has historically been kind of treated as this, you know, inferior science that's, you know, very inaccurate and we can't know anything. And it was largely dismissed within conventional medicine. And as a result, they don't really get much training in nutrition. And as a result, their actual a lot of medical doctors approach looking at nutrition as if they're interpreting, you know, biomedical research, biomedical standard of RCTs, blah, blah, blah. And their lack of subject-specific knowledge actually plays out when you're thinking about how they interpret, you know, what an exposure of interest is or what they consider a good or bad study and this kind of thing. And I think that kind of overconfidence combined with undercompetence can be dangerous in any context, but particularly where someone then carries that combination forward with the authority bias of being a doctor and then saying, well, obviously I'm a medical doctor, I grasp this. And it's like, yeah, but you know really nothing about nutrition as a subject of inquiry. And that lack of subject-specific knowledge shows in a lot of the positions that are articulated. And then I think that what happens is, over time, once someone becomes famous and their speaking fees and their books and all of their, you know, public persona is wrapped up in this identity of being a kind of vegan doctor or plant-based doctor, there's no going back from that. There's no putting your hands up and saying I was wrong, because when people do that, the vegan community seems to eviscerate anybody who dares actually say I've changed my mind on something. So I don't think it's a community that is particularly encouraging of kind of openness and inquisitiveness. And I think that in many issues it's been led down a garden path in terms of evidence by some of these kind of very populist US based plant-based doctors. And I'm quite ruthless with this. I follow a simple heuristic that if a medical professional or any healthcare professional really inserts their dietary allegiance before their title as a healthcare professional, whatever that diet is, vegan or low carb, keto, then I simply can't, I just don't deem them as credible. I'm just like, it's a ludicrous proposition, you know, like I don't see credible cardiologists going around calling themselves the atorvastatin doctor, you know, and it's just it's nonsense, you know? So
so there's like
some thoughts.
There's a vested interest there because they've already got likely some kind of moral grounding for choosing this way of living or this way of eating. So that in by itself is kind of skewing their interpretation of the research to some degree. When we look at different studies, and this will be interesting for the listeners because they might not have heard this before, would you be able to quickly run through the hierarchy of evidence when you're looking at these studies? And then maybe that would give listeners a better idea of, you know, when someone is referencing something in regards to this, how they can interpret that?
Yeah, so broadly in biomedical sciences, there's this hierarchy of evidence that's shaped like a pyramid. And on the top of it, you have meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And then the next underneath is randomized controlled trials, preferably double-blind. And the ideal is that the meta-analyses include randomized controlled trials. And then underneath that, you have prospective cohort studies, which are observational studies of large populations over time. And within the biomedical tradition, observational evidence is considered worthless, basically. And it's very easy to do really gold standard, so to speak, randomized control trials. You can recruit huge patient populations. You can give them a very clearly defined intervention, which is often a drug. And then you can compare that drug to nothing, to a placebo. And you can have all of the people in the study not know whether they're getting the drug or the placebo. So they're blind to what they're getting. And then all the researchers can be blind too. So it's double blinded. And this is whereas nutrition starts to run into some difficulties, right? I mean, if I'm telling you to eat olive oil, I can't have you being blindfolded for the whole study, right? It's people have to eat. So for nutrition interventions that don't involve supplements, that is really difficult to actually satisfy a criteria for. And often, if you're the investigator, you need to tell people to do something, or you certainly want them to do something. So, and because most studies for nutrition in the short term, we look at intermediate risk factors. So if we want to understand in a short term randomized control trial the relationship with a certain diet and diabetes, we're not actually looking at diabetes as an outcome. We're looking at the effect of that diet on blood glucose or insulin levels. Same with cardiovascular disease. We're not actually waiting for people to die of cardiovascular disease, getting them to eat diet A versus diet B. We're looking at the effects of those diets on LDL cholesterol. And that's because we can't do those trials over 40 years. So that's where observational research in nutrition is actually the cornerstone of the field. And the field draws a lot of criticism for that. But, that's where we're looking at people over 10, 20, 30 years, and we're seeing what their diet was like, earlier in life before they had diseases. And then we're trying to follow that up. And so they're really the kind of the corner stone styles of trial. But for nutrition, it becomes complicated because a lot of meta-analyses are of prospective cohort studies, but that's like comparing apples and oranges. You're taking a population eating a diet in Japan and throwing that population study in with a diet in America and another study from a population in Finland. Like, they're not comparable. Nothing about them beyond diet is comparable, So nutrition research, there's a lot of nuance and technicalities, and it can be easy if you have a preconceived view about diet and health, right? If you already have come to a conclusion about what you think the best diet is, whether that's vegan or whether that's low carb, you can build a case in favor of that. It doesn't mean it's a very good case or a very strong case, but you can build, and that's why there's so much confusion, certainly in the public, with nutrition, because honestly, you can argue nearly any position. It's just a question of whether that position actually has any evidential weight and integrity to it. But that involves then knowing enough about the research to be able to pick apart why it might or might not hold for what the claim actually is. So I think in a complicated field, though, that nuance gets swept under the rug for, here's my conclusion, this is what I believe about diet and health, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find studies that can bolster that belief.
Yeah, like you mentioned, I think it's very, I guess, especially with like observational studies, it's very contextual, isn't it? So based on, like you're saying, maybe the ethnicity group is completely different, and so there's a confounding variable there within that, and how you, I guess, apply that to your own life or to the people you're speaking to. With observational research itself, I guess this is one of the things that is often people either will just blanketly throw out the research because they're like, oh, it's only an observational study, it's not an RCT, so we're not going to take that into account. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum where there is no RCTs on a particular topic, or it's too hard to do. Like, I was reading the article yesterday, and they quoted some guy who was saying, look, if I wanted to do like the be-all study on diet, I would need to take 1,000 kids born today and put them on one specific diet for the rest of their life.
For the rest of their life.
Yeah, and they can only eat that thing. I'd probably have to put them in prison to do it because they're going to want to go and eat some McDonald's or whatever the case may be. It's just not going to happen. So I guess
it might happen in China, but
Yeah, well, it might do. Yeah, there's a whole
this
mess
is
going
the
on over there.
frontier.
Yeah,
If you want to abandon research ethics, just
yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, a whole nother
yeah.
topic. So
Uh,
so yeah, so I guess when we come to observational research, um, how do we know whether we should take it or leave it?
well, there's two ways of thinking about that. The first is we've no choice but to take it,
Mm.
right? We're never going to have 40-year RCTs in nutrition, and even in any and even if we did, it would become an observational study after about 5 of those years, most likely.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, because people aren't going to, if you're telling people to eat an ounce of nuts a day and that's the intervention, I mean, and you're going to expect them to do that religiously every day for 40 years, like it would become an observational study. So there, and that's the reality that I come at this issue from. I'm like, look, observational research is going to be, prospective cohort studies are going to be the cornerstone of nutrition science for the foreseeable future. So rather than engage in the kind of the dismissal and the hand waving of it off, let's improve methodology, which is all happening. Like, people talk about the limitations of nutrition observational research as if people in the field like don't know that these limitations exist.
Yeah.
Rather than the fact that for 30 years people have been working to improve methodology, improve how we assess diet and the accuracy of that assessment. Now I have a study running currently, for example, where I've got people taking photographs of their meals on a cell phone, and it timestamps. So every time they take a photograph, the time that it was taken at is captured. So I know exactly what time they ate at, which is what we're looking at. So, these methodologies are only going to improve with technological advances, and it's not as and here's the real thing, like, it's just not as inaccurate as people think it is. The inaccuracy or accuracy of it just depends on what we're talking about. If you're talking about a niche vitamin or mineral, if we're saying, well, how accurate can an observational study look at people's B2 intake, vitamin B2 intake? Not really reliable at all, because water soluble vitamins, we pee them out, and you do one assessment, it's not really. But if we're talking about the major macronutrients, carbohydrate, fat in particular, and then the fat subtype, saturated fat, poly, monounsaturated fat, and we're talking about, say, fiber or complex versus refined carbohydrate, dietary protein, and even then other like omega-3 fatty acids, for example, because we don't produce them in the body, easier to kind of measure in some ways on observational research. So the question of, is it accurate? The answer to that is, it depends on what your exposure is. It depends on what you're talking about. And for the major macronutrients and those kind of, and certain other nutrients, there's sufficient accuracy in nutritional epidemiology to give us information in the results that we can use to influence public health policy, for sure.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So I guess what the crux of this conversation, where it's leading, is kind of onto the question of, if we look at a lot of the data that's out currently, is there actually sufficient evidence to say that red meat, dairy, eggs, fish is actually harmful to human health? And this is I'm kind of on the mindset through the studies I've done with like MNU, for example, and just since then, and the different people I've been around, of the view that you can have a sufficiently healthy dietary pattern that includes animal products if you want it to be that way, and the same goes for a plant exclusive diet. I'm of the opinion that you can do both very well if you have the access to foods and the knowledge base and all these things in place. But then we have the blanket statements of like, no, meat will cause cancer. Oh no, dairy will, it's full of hormones and it's going to give you breast cancer, or whatever the case may be. So these blanket statements that are thrown out. And so if we kind of maybe jump into red meat to start with, and kind of dive into some of the claims around red meat, a lot of it is related to, cancer and cardiovascular disease. What would you say are the biggest claims there? And then potentially, what is actually the science saying on is red meat itself? And and we can include or exclude processed meat in this if you like. what does the data say on that in terms of human health?
Yeah, I definitely think cancer is probably the biggest claim, the most consistent claim about red meat. Cardiovascular disease, yes, you see it claimed as, but not with the kind of like, not with the level of fervor that you see the the claims about cancer
Gotcha.
made. I think with red meat, it's important to be granular. So, as between processed meat and unprocessed meat, there is a clear distinction in the literature. And I think that we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that high, consistent intakes of processed meat consumption, i.e., meat that is salted, cured, and otherwise, um, is carcinogenic, particularly for colon cancer, colorectal cancer. And I think that we could probably also say that although, that with regard to processed meat and cardiovascular disease, that there is a likely causal relationship between them there. And that may be mediated by processed meat nitrates and nitrites, and an interaction potentially with heme iron, certainly for carcinogenesis in the colon. But for cardiovascular disease, it seems like that might be kind of nitrites that mediates the relationship with processed meat. So even within the kind of, shall I say, omnivorous community, I think within the evidence-based, science-based side, I don't see many people argue against that point. And so I think we could kind of park processed meat. And that's not to say that someone can't have it, again, if they so choose, like some chorizo in an omelet every now and then. But we're talking about intakes at a dose threshold of about 50 grams a day and over. So that would be kind of relatively, high daily intake. And so that would be something that we would not recommend. And we could say that, yes, that kind of threshold and consistency of intake is causally increases risk for cancer, and appears to causally increase risk for cardiovascular disease. Unprocessed meats, a little more complicated. The IARC, where they designated processed meat carcinogenic to humans, designated unprocessed meat as probably carcinogenic. And there was an argument back after that was probably an unwarranted conclusion because they filled in the gaps on a lot of evidence, and primarily with mechanistic evidence. And mechanistic evidence is really important. This is where you kind of maybe feed, rats a certain diet or something, and you're trying to understand what mechanisms might actually be increasing the risk for whatever the disease is. But the reason was because the cohort studies, the observational studies, were quite inconsistent. And the reason that they may be inconsistent might relate to the actual levels of red meat intake that you see consumed in the populations. So if we look at the US cohorts, where red meat intake daily tends to be higher, I'm talking about unprocessed red meat now, so yep. Park processed meat. So unprocessed red meat in some of the US cohorts, you see at 170, 180 grams a day. And in the cohorts that have been conducted very well in terms of their dietary assessment and have been able to compare these high levels of intake to kind of much lower levels of, say, like 20 to 50 grams a day, then we see a consistent increase in risk. That's even after accounting for, say, vegetable and fruit intake. But if you come over to Europe, you don't tend to see those effects. And that's because average daily unprocessed red meat consumption in a lot of populations in Europe is not particularly high. It's not over 100 grams a day. And if you go over to some of the Japanese cohorts, then you also see no real association. In fact, you see a kind of reduction in risk if you compared 60, 70 grams a day with, say, 10 grams a day. Now, and we see some of that in Europe as well. And so that suggests that either there is genuinely just no effect or potentially a benefit. Why could there be a benefit? Well, sometimes you see this reduced risk in women, and it may be related to actually heme iron. So heme iron is a real double-edged sword here, because in high levels, in high consistent amounts in a diet that's high in red meat, it may have some advert. But in women, because particularly in reproductive years, because of menstruation, lower iron levels, higher iron recommendations, maybe there's a benefit. And interestingly, a recent study, and in two recent studies, I think can help us piece this puzzle together a bit more. One was an analysis of the EPIC cohort, which is in Europe. And although the average intakes, like I said, in Europe are kind of low enough, in men, it's like 100 maybe grams a day, give or take. And in women, it's about 65. And that's the whole cohort, right? And so the EPIC cohort has people from 10 different European countries. So you might get as low as 20 grams a day in some countries like Greece, or you might get up to 70, kind of 80 grams a day in like Denmark or Sweden. But they did have a small subgroup that were consuming about 160 grams a day. And compared to the lower intake, there was an increase in risk in that group. Now, it was kind of borderline insignificant. But why I thought that was interesting was because I was like, okay, that dose seems to be more consistent with what we see in some of the US cohorts. Mm. And then there was a study recently, which was really nice. It was the Alberta Tomorrow Project, Canadian study. But rather than just adjust for fruit and vegetable intake statistically, which basically means you kind of look at whether the effect cancels out across your whole cohort, what they did was they looked at 3 different levels of unprocessed red meat intake and processed meat, but they looked at it relative to either low, moderate, or high fruit and vegetable intake. And in the group consuming 500 grams of red meat a week, now not a day, a week, high fruit and vegetable intake, there was no association. But in the group consuming the same amount of meat with the lowest fruit and vegetable intake, there was a significant increase in risk. So this suggests, so if we divide that into daily dose, give or take, the average was 460 grams a week, probably about 60, 65 grams a day. That's more consistent with what we see in EPIC and some of the Asian cohorts. So I think for unprocessed red meat, there may be a dose threshold where consistently consuming higher amounts over like 160, 70, 80 grams a day might increase risk over time, even if someone's eating vegetables and fruit. But that more moderate intakes of kind of less than 100 grams a day or less than 500 grams a week may not increase risk once someone is eating high levels of fruit and vegetable. And right now, I don't think we can resolve that either way. So what people tend to do is resolve it against the way they view their own dietary beliefs. So you'll get people in the plant-based community will say, well, it's still a risk. And you'll get people on the other side that will say, oh, there's no risk, just eat your fruits and vegetables. I personally don't think we can say that there is a risk at those thresholds of less than 100 grams a day at this point. But I don't think we can be entirely certain on that either. So I do think eating plenty of fruits and vegetables in the context of an otherwise healthy diet, I do think that some unprocessed red meat consumption can be occasionally consumed, but I would not be consuming high daily amounts of it, even if I had, a healthy kind of wider diet pattern.
Are there any theories in regards to like the mechanisms as to why like these higher intakes of 150, 160 grams would lead to those adverse outcomes? Is it something that is being promoted relatively often within the plant-based community, such as like TMAO, which is one of those things that kind of crops up? Is there something around that as one of the mechanisms? Or I know we had a little bit of a chat over email around this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
So currently I am of the opinion, and I'll articulate why I think the evidence supports this, that TMAO is a red herring. It's been described as an independent causal risk factor that explains the connection between diet and cardiovascular disease that is mediated by the microbiota. That's the kind of proposed causal chain. And yes, observationally, you can find associations between high levels of TMAO and cardiovascular disease. The production of TMAO in humans does require gut bacteria, and they metabolize certain kind of nutrients that are generally found in animal products like carnitine or choline into trimethylamine, which is TMA, and that's absorbed by the liver and converted in the liver to TMAO. And that TMAO then appears in your blood circulating. But there's a couple of holes in this story. The first is that there are certain foods that are very high in preformed TMAO, and fish is one of them. And fish is generally associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. There's also the fact that a method of analysis known as Mendelian randomization, which is where you look at genetic predispositions for a certain outcome. And MR are they're very difficult studies to do properly. You need to be sure that your gene, for example, you're looking at a gene that increases risk or that increases blood TMAO levels, for example. You need to make sure that that gene isn't necessarily associated with other outcomes that could interfere with your analysis. But the Mendelian randomization on increased levels of TMAO and a range of disease outcomes, coronary heart disease, stroke, heart attack, cardiovascular disease generally, show no causal relationship at all, or proposed I'm loath, even with Mendelian randomization, I'm actually hesitant to use the word causal. So I would say they do not show an association, a genetic association between high levels of plasma TMAO and cardiovascular disease, or even diabetes or otherwise. And then there's real, in the intervention studies, there's massive inconsistency and huge inter-individual response to feeding someone TMAO. And it means that there's, from short-term studies, the likelihood of a lot of false positives. And so, we've seen that. I remember one recent study which fed people kind of animal meats first and then fed them plant meats afterwards. It's after consuming the plant meat, there was no change in TMAO. But if you consume the animal meats first, TMAO levels rose initially and then declined to similar levels as during the plant meat phase. So, there's a lot of inter-individual difference in response to that. And it shows that, our microbiota has often short-term responses to changes in diet, and then they revert basically to a stable composition once the intervention ends. So, for example, a study looked at beef, eggs, fish, and fruit on TMAO levels, and found that high TMAO producers had a particular ratio of their gut bacteria, which was high firmicutes and bacteroidetes, right? Now, the reason this is important is because we see this ratio in people with obesity. We see this ratio in people with metabolic disease. And it's a ratio that may be consequent on a certain dietary pattern, Western dietary pattern. It's a ratio, though, that also might be consequent on the actual metabolic state of the individual. And the final kind of piece that really just doesn't add up is that we've got a number of recent studies that look at TMAO levels being high in people with metabolic disease. And so a more plausible, theory is that, the elevated levels of TMAO that we see, the reason they're associated with cardiovascular disease is because of the underlying ill health of the individual and of the population studied. There's too much variability between people for it to be considered an independent causal risk factor, even if it was. The variation can differ between people between 30% and 270%. And it's not particularly reproducible. So if I measured your TMAO levels now and measured them in a year's time, it could be all over the place. So it's not a particularly good biomarker for observational studies. So, yes, the production of TMA requires the microbiota, and TMAO does reflect liver detoxification of TMA, but it appears that TMAO is probably a proxy for metabolic dysfunction or the activity of certain bacteria in the gut, but it's not directly causal of disease itself. And it's difficult to support a claim that it exists, that it explains a causal link between a food and heart disease, given that, again, like I said, fish contain very high levels of preformed TMAO, and they would be associated with reduced risks. So I'm not convinced about TMAO at all, and I don't think a lot of people in the research community necessarily are. I don't even think it's useful as a biomarker. I think if there is a link between unprocessed red meat consumption at these higher doses, I think it's more likely to relate to cooking method, charring, and the production of potentially procarcinogenic compounds as a result of, say, grilling. And if you look at the associations in America, like that's a very common cooking method there. I think you've also got the production. You don't have nitrates and nitrites in the concentrations you have in processed meat, but they are still present, and they can interact with heme iron to form potentially carcinogenic compounds. And of course, there's the relationship between nitrates, nitrites, and cardiovascular disease itself. And then I think, even though it's often adjusted for, I think that there's still the contribution of high animal fat generally, and saturated fat in particular, to cardiovascular disease, which is something we do know. So I don't think it's TMAO, but I do think there are other mechanisms by which high, unprocessed meat consumption could still contribute to increased risk. And it relates to, heme, nitrates, nitrites, saturated fat, animal fat generally, and potentially, and again, exacerbated by the absence or low intakes of vegetables and fruit and fiber and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I think one of the things that just popped up in my mind, I haven't actually thought about covering this, but is there the same kind of links there as you describe between heme iron and the nitrates and potentially the saturated fat levels of animal products, and especially in like, say, a red meat product? Is that the same link that we would see in, say, a white meat product such as chicken? Because chicken is one of those ones that is kind of often used as like, hey, this is a really healthy option for a someone who's gonna go into a diet intervention, and they're like, hey, like, focus on lean chicken because that's gonna be really healthy for you. Is there any correlation that you've seen in the data in relation to some of those ideas and high chicken intakes?
Yeah, well, so you obviously the color of the meat gives away its heme iron content, which is not very high.
Yeah.
And you don't tend to get the level of saturated fat in a chicken breast or turkey or white meat generally. You might get it in some of the kind of darker meat parts of a bird, but not particularly high. And you don't get compounds like nitrates and nitrites, and you don't really get that kind of interaction effect. And so, yeah, generally, the substitution analyses, if you replace red meat with white meat, that there's a benefit there. There's a reduction in risk for people doing that. So, I mean, overall, yes, is it considered a beneficial substitution for people in omnivorous diets to replace red meat with white meat? That would appear to be present in the data. Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for clearing that one up. I guess, if we move on into dairy intakes, and this is one that I think, most people can probably agree that there are significant issues with the way that we are producing dairy in terms of the ethical component and, of course, the environmental side of dairy production. But if we kind of put that aside, as something to cover at another time, and we look at it purely from a human health perspective, there's often, arguments that, we're not made to drink milk from another animal, or, we wean off milk at a young age. And then, there are obviously, there's a certain percentage of the population who don't have the enzyme to be able to digest lactose and this type of thing. But then there's often the big ones are thrown out around, like hormones in dairy and, and its effects on different cancers. So, this is obviously something you've seen a lot of yourself. What do you make of some of these claims? And I know that even from reading the Sigma statement on dairy, there is a lot of nuance to dairy, just in terms of because dairy is such an umbrella term. And we're talking about cheese, we're talking about yogurt, we're talking about low fat products. So yeah, what are your thoughts on these claims, mate?
I find dairy almost elicits more of a kind of visceral, like, revulsion in the plant-based community than even red meat. Like it's bizarre. And some of the, I mean, the whole like, we're not designed to eat, like, what are we designed to press olives into an oil? Like,
Yeah.
it's just a non sequitur of an argument. And we wean off dairy. Says who? Like, populations, there are numerous populations in the world that don't ever wean off dairy, and two of them are blue zones populations where a quarter of their total daily energy intake comes from dairy produce: Costa Rica and Greece. Sure, there are certain populations that have a genetic insufficiency of the lactase enzyme. That's not the poor dairy's fault. Like, that's a deficiency of an enzyme responsible for breaking down sugar. Interestingly, there's the potential for, even in those populations, to be okay with dairy consumption. We see massive increase in prevalence of dairy consumption in East Asia, particularly over what they call the nutrition transition. A lot of increase in kind of milk and dairy produce consumption in a population with low, prevalence of kind of lactase adaptation. So yeah, some of those kind of, we're not designed for this, or it's only for weaning babies and stuff. I mean, that they're nonsense. They're nonsense arguments. But unfortunately, they weave their way into the discussion. So yeah, I try not to get bogged down in that at all. And yeah, like, I mean, to your point, it's absolutely, it is important, even with the red meat aspect of the conversation we're having. Yes, there are environmental and ethical considerations that we do need to consider. But the problem, I think, and coming back to this talk of why do you have people, say, within the plant-based community that are kind of happy to mount some of these fairly spurious kind of arguments and claims, is I think it's where that moral, ethical aspect gets mixed up, and people have a difficulty separating an objective assessment of the evidence of health effects from the moral and ethical implications of consumption. And they should be considered together, but first, the evidential assessment of the health effects has to happen independent of that. And then we can discuss, what might be the considerations for including or excluding or having some, and what have you. So with dairy, it's a funny one. I mean, does dairy cause it? If you really appraised the literature for dairy and cancer, I think people would be surprised. I mean, it's one of the food groups that has the most consistent and strongest reductions in risk for colorectal cancer. And that's been acknowledged by the World Cancer Research Fund, the IARC, and otherwise. So dairy reliably and predictably over time reduces risk of colorectal cancer. With prostate cancer, it's murky. There's been suggested increases in risk that may be mediated by IGF-1, but it's not particularly consistent. But there could be an increase in risk. And with breast cancer, that's mixed, but it's actually overall in favor of a reduction in risk. And that's often stronger in certain estrogen receptor types, certain kind of some of the genetic aspects of breast cancer. So, do hormones and antibiotics in milk cause cancer? Well, one, the levels of hormones and antibiotics in milk that are used as part of the husbandry process are essentially undetectable as far as human effects go, as far as we know. And the safety thresholds are established not by nutrition science necessarily, but by toxicology. And it's the same process that informs how much artificial sweeteners, for example, we can have in soda, or diet sodas and stuff like that. So it's identifying where risks may lie, and it's deeming certain thresholds. And this is what I think people, because we see this happen in the artificial sweeteners conversation all the time. Just because something's present doesn't mean it's having an effect. Just because there could be trace levels of an antibiotic in a sample of milk doesn't necessarily mean it's of any sort of threshold that's a worry for human health outcomes. And we would have fairly reckless food regulatory systems, if that were to be the case. So, and again, if we just focus on human outcome data, well, then you don't see this, ubiquitous cancerous onslaught from the dairy. Actually, on the whole, you would see certainly strong reductions in colorectal cancer, some reductions in breast cancer risk that are stronger in certain estrogen receptor subtypes, and prostate cancer, perhaps an increase in risk. So, it's nuanced, and it's if that increase is present in relation to prostate cancer, then it's not mediated by hormones or antibiotics. It's potentially mediated by the anabolic effects of dairy on IGF-1 signaling. Now, people take that and grossly over extrapolate it and say, well, IGF-1 feeds cancers or drives cancers, therefore anything that increases IGF-1 is pro-carcinogenic. That's just faulty reasoning, because that's obviously not what we see in terms of longer term human outcomes. So I think that dairy, unfortunately, I think we need to, you touched on this, and it is an important point. Like, dairy is a broad food group. And so when I make these comments about the kind of overall associations for dairy, I'm generally talking about particular foods: yogurt, milk, and cheese. And I'm certainly not referring to butter, which, does not have the characteristics that those foods have, particularly yogurt and cheese. And there's the added dimension of fermentation, which means that even people who, for example, have reduced activity of the lactase enzyme may actually tolerate fermented dairy foods better, because the fermentation kind of alters the kind of the qualities of the food, so to speak. So, and they have other properties as well, calcium and otherwise, that kind of all interact together in this food matrix. So, whereas butter doesn't have these characteristics and is really just rich in saturated fat, and putting it in your coffee is a bad idea, and high levels of butter I would argue, certainly increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. So dairy is a very broad term, and when it comes to the health effects, the most consistent and strongest would be for yogurt and cheese. Milk is kind of neutral. Depends on the study and the population, but it's kind of neutral. There's some good evidence that low-fat milk reduces risk of diabetes. Why low-fat versus non-fat? Is it the contribution of additional saturated fat in the whole-fat milk? Not really sure. And then you can find some observations that are kind of neutral for whole milk as well, like full-fat milk. So they would be the three foods that these associations would be kind of present for. And then, foods like butter. There's a lot of interest in kefir, which is like a fermented milk. It's common in kind of Eastern Europe and Turkey. And the big interest in that is gut health. Probably we're just not really at a point of being able to make conclusions from the evidence there either way, one way or the other. It might reduce lactose intolerance, and there's some evidence that it might reduce H. pylori infection, like these stomach infections. But really, that's all very kind of early doors human research, and there's no way we can make a conclusion one way or the other yet of whether it is good for gut health. So I think dairy. I think the problem with it as well is within the plant base. I mean, I tuned into a Clubhouse talk a few weeks ago that had a couple of the Game Changers athletes on it, and just the absolute crap. Sorry, I don't want to. This is difficult because they're billing it as their lived experience, right? So I don't want to say that their lived experience is crap, but it's the way it's framed as like, I stopped eating dairy and I could feel, my body cleanse. It's like, I'm going to call. Yeah. What do you mean you could feel your body cleanse? Cleanse of what? And then they pull a veil of science over it, and then you've David Katz there to kind of give them a veneer of legitimacy of what they're saying. And I was like, this is horrible to listen to. Because for everyone that does that within the plant-based community about dairy, we can go out and find someone on a carnivore diet that will tell us their arthritis disappeared and all their joints healed. Like, this is why we don't rely on anecdote, whether they're an Olympic athlete or just average Joe in the street. I don't care about anecdote. Like,
That's right.
But I think we have a lot of blurring of those lines within the plant-based community, where everyone's almost happy to rely on someone's anecdote over any evidence, and that's not unique to the plant-based community. I will say the low carbers are just as bad for, I go by the evidence I see. Well, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that leads us to quackery.
Yeah, I don't know if you've looked into this at all, Alan, but that it just reminded me of like the idea that, you know, a lot of people suffer from things like acne or asthma or respiratory problems, and then they have these anecdotal experiences of removing dairy and suddenly skin clears up, or they feel like they have an easier time breathing and these types of things. Have you heard those statements yourself in terms of anecdote? And then, have you seen anything on that?
So I was actually, have a good friend of mine here in the UK is a consultant dermatologist, and before COVID, she'd asked me if I'd be happy to prepare a kind of a presentation at a derm conference on nutrition and skin. And I'd never delved into that literature before. I was like, okay, so this will be interesting.
Yeah. Great.
So with acne, there are some associations with high levels of dairy consumption. Some of them are inseparable from high levels of whey protein consumption. And they're almost always in kind of like either adolescence or early teens. And there's a lot to pick apart that is difficult with identifying dairy. I mean, there's the fact that they're going through a natural phase of exploded androgens anyway. There's certainly, in terms of clinical dermatology, my understanding is most dermatologists will see if someone's like really high use of whey protein shakes, and discontinuing whey protein shakes may result in an improvement in acne symptoms. But as far as eliminating or eradicating dairy as a food, that's really inconsistent. It may relate to dose, like how much is someone consuming? Are they consuming 200 grams of a yogurt a day, or are they consuming a liter of milk? You know, they're not the same exposure, so to speak. And it's also difficult to pick apart the potential interaction with their hormonal state that they're in, so to speak. So there are some. The evidence is very, very weak, very weak. But there is some evidence, and I know that, you know, certainly clinically, I think dermatologists are often open to at least trialing a period of dairy-free, and if nothing improves, you know, there's no point in continuing. The respiratory stuff, there is a little more evidence in terms of, you know, intervention, and it's really difficult to. There is that anecdote, and that anecdote appears consistent, but there's no evidence that dairy actually increases mucus production, for example, or otherwise. And so there's another theory in all of this, which is the potential for what people are experiencing, not necessarily to be the cause of kind of dairy per se, but poorly calibrated immune systems. So dietary kind of potential antigens are all pretty common, and we know. So, for example, development of kind of food intolerances or allergies in children, it's always the same, right? It's like tree nuts, peanuts, milk, and then shellfish in adulthood. There's a couple of other foods, right? And the reason that the same foods are the most common culprits for kind of adverse reactions to foods is because of the molecular weight of their proteins, and soy as well. Sorry. So it may be that that's the case. It's just dairy is more ubiquitously consumed than, you know, shellfish or otherwise. But if people weren't, and again, everything I'm suggesting here is kind of hypothetical, and there isn't great evidence for this. But it's, if people are exposed sufficiently to some of these foods, particularly dairy, like the vast majority of children or infants that have cow's milk allergy will grow out of it and acquire immune tolerance to cow's milk over time. So maybe is there a proportion of people that kind of don't fully and have residual symptoms, or otherwise a kind of a little bit of an immune response? Maybe there's some gaps in our knowledge there, and I'm always loath to fill in gaps with something certain. But the one thing that does appear clear is that it's very difficult to see any actual evidence that supports that dairy does like increase mucus production or anything like that. So, cautious about that as an anecdote. I think maybe it relates more to kind of more immune system stuff, and it's interesting. It would be interesting to see studies that look at cross reactivity, like to people who self-report that. Also, have a difficulty, for example, with like peanuts or otherwise. But I'll tell you one piece of evidence that I find really kind of interesting in all of this. And like we talk about the placebo effect all the time. There's also a thing called the nocebo effect, right? You convince yourself like, something bad's going to happen, right?
Right.
So, right. So there was an interesting study. There was a study that surveyed raw milk consumers in America and asked them why they consumed. It was a survey, but they said, why do you consume raw milk? Some people were like, supports local farmers, environment, all that. But the majority were like, oh, it's because I can't tolerate, pasteurized, homogenized milk. Okay, so this is a really interesting study that a group at Stanford did, where they got like organic raw cow's milk and also organic pasteurized cow's milk in people who like self-reported as like dairy, intolerant, so to speak. And they did test them beforehand to confirm that they were like, there was people who were lactose intolerant and weren't. And interestingly, like, the raw milk resulted in more hydrogen production than the commercial milks, shall we say. And like, I remember reading that and just thinking, I reckon there's a lot of people who convince themselves that they have a problem with dairy or other foods, for example. And consume it and then just sit there and interpret every grumble in their stomach. Or like, so here's an example, right? I live in an area of London with amazing like South Asian food, like Indian restaurants, like Punjabi, Sri Lankan restaurants, right?
Gotcha.
I'll go around, I'll eat a hot dish. My nose will stream, right? I'm not taking to honestly, I'm in the bathroom and I'm just like, I didn't realize it was like, I'm not on Instagram telling everyone that my nose is streaming because I'm allergic to
because you're
turmeric, like
just Sri Lankan,
I'm like, oh, I'm sweating, my nose has got that like bit of sweat on it because like there's just like heat from it,
yes
I'm like, oh my god, I've started sweating after I ate this food, it's like, so I think a lot of people just absolutely nocebo affect themselves when it comes to dairy.
I think you see the same thing with like gluten as well, right? It's the same sort of idea.
Right, yeah. I can't tolerate bread. I'm bloated.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, well, there is a certain natural bloating response to eating.
Right.
Like, like there's a normal part of human physiology. So, I think that's a really big point. And I think a lot of people just don't even think about the fact that there is a nocebo and it's very,
strong.
It's likely very strong. Exactly. And I think also, if we come to wrap up dairy, I think the idea, I think people do forget is that dairy is one of those products that if we're looking at global, like human survival, it's one of those products that in many different areas around the world is just essential for providing essential nutrients to children that potentially don't have access to the plethora of food that we have in the Western world, and so if they've got a cow out back that they can get dairy from, then that's going to, hopefully avoid some of those like stunting deficiencies that we might see.
and that's clear. And I was at a conference again pre lockdown, but one of the researchers there was doing stable isotope tracer studies, which are really accurate ways now, really great advancement in nutrition science of like looking at how something's digested and absorbed. They were doing studies in India, and these were communities essentially that they were technically lacto-vegetarian. But because of Indian government policies and all this other red tape crap, they weren't really having access to eggs and dairy in the way that they would usually incorporate it into their diet. So their diet was basically relying on like mung beans and one or two other staples, and stunting was a major issue.
Okay.
Because the quality of the dietary protein that they were getting. And I remember one of his papers was saying that just 200 mils of milk a day in that population would be sufficient to prevent stunting. So yeah, I think that's a really important point you raise. And most of these conversations that we have, I always hear that like people in the plant-based, the world needs to eat a plant-based diet. I'm like, the world does eat a plant-based diet. It's called food insecurity. like it's just that level of, detachment that I think is present, again, not just within, the plant-based, but generally when it comes to, I see this with arguments about, because I don't know if you read the article on my blog about like poverty and diet, and I was, I get into this argument all the time from some bro who literally lives in a gym and training people, and like has the capacity to meal prep and all this kind of stuff, and he's like, people just need to be more responsible. I'm like, we see this lack of genuine awareness for a lot of issues in nutrition, and that affect what's on people's plate and what's best for them a lot in conversations about nutrition. And I think a lot of what we're talking about now in terms of the considerations for plant-based diets, plant predominant or whatever label it gets, are very much kind of confined to, for the most part, the kind of the West, so to speak, or some of the bigger kind of Asian economies, because they're the ones responsible for the carbon footprint.
Right.
They're the ones with these dietary patterns that can benefit from altering the food supply and reducing some of the contributions to these emissions. So, the rest of the world's already plant-based. Don't worry. They just don't have enough to eat,
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And it's a common discussion I have, because it's something I've never promoted, is the whole idea that, everyone should be vegan or everyone should be plant-based, because it's just not a reality of how people are living around the world. But people, they're only just looking at their situation, or, the fact that they live in America, or they live in New Zealand, or they live in Ireland, where these issues aren't such a big deal, it comes back to a context, right? It comes back to how we're assessing these things and applying it to different areas and different ethnicities around the globe. I did want to quickly touch on with you, Alan, with fish, right? So
yes,
our community is pretty aware of the benefits of omega-3s in the diet, and they will prioritize a certain level of ALA based omega-3s, whether it's through chia or ground flax or things like this, or walnuts. And then many people will actually end up supplementing with an omega-3 algae-based supplement as well, which is fantastic. But would you see these benefits of consuming fish that would be outside of consuming omega-3 intake from the fish, or even just the protein intake from the fish, that would warrant somebody going, hey, look, I'm going to include fish in my diet for that reason?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is the potential, a big focus of nutrition in recent years has been like the concept of the food matrix, right? It does the biological activity of a nutrient. Is it influenced by the characteristics of a food itself that the nutrient comes in? And we do have evidence that is the case. Food, what we would call food synergy, And so my only thing would be that in, a lot of the long-term studies that we have are looking at fish consumption. Now, you're trying to isolate the effects of EPA and DHA. And those two fatty acids, I think we can break it down into life stages, right? I think most people, I would hope anyway, in the plant-based community accept that DHA is essential for infant brain development, and that, you know, a vegan pregnant mother should supplement with a direct source of DHA. Right. I'd hope that's accepted within the community. And then if we go to the end of the kind of life stage, so to speak, later on in life, well, you know, the associations between DHA and reduced risk of Alzheimer's and dementia are consistent, and we see them in different populations. We see them if you do an autopsy study where you get people's brains who died of Alzheimer's versus died of like health, you know, just normal, and you look at their brain levels of DHA and omega-3 fatty acids. The big question, and what I see people in the plant-based community argue, is, well, there's no evidence of a benefit in healthy people in the middle of their life. Well, the problem is nutrients don't exist as either, you know, you're taking it or not, right? Nutrients exist on a bell curve, right? Of we have inadequacy or deficiency, and then we have adequacy, and then we have excess potentially or toxicity, right? Now, most conditions of deficiency have been eradicated in Western countries in the population for the most part. But and this is a known kind of challenge for nutrition science, and we see this. I can name numerous examples of what I'm about to say, either related to vitamin E or vitamin D or otherwise. If you're doing short-term interventions, which is where most of our evidence for otherwise healthy people come from, and everyone already has relatively adequate intakes of a nutrient, giving them more of that does not mean that there's a benefit, right? Once you've got adequate, generally we tend to see effects where someone has insufficient levels of intake. But unfortunately, for multiple reasons, like for example, ethics committees will often not allow you to recruit people who are deficient in a nutrient. So it becomes difficult. So we do these studies in nutrition. It's like, oh, there wasn't really that much of, or even if there was a little effect, it was quite small. But that's often because we're doing trials in otherwise healthy people who have sufficient levels of intake of whatever that given nutrient is. My worry is that cumulatively, all of the evidence that we have for EPA and DHA would suggest that some is better than none and more is better than less. Now, does someone have to consume fish to get that benefit? The short answer is maybe not, and arguably not. But what we do know from short-term interventions is that ALA might cover your basis for EPA, but it doesn't really seem to cover basis for DHA. In fact, it may actually drive down DHA levels. Okay. The conversion process in humans is low. So for everyone arguing that we've no evidence of a benefit in healthy people, the logical corollary to that is we also don't have evidence that it's not a risk over the long term to deliberately omit direct sources of a nutrient. Right. Those two criticisms go hand in hand, and you can't have one without the other. And so I tend to find myself now encouraging people following exclusively plant-based diets not to obviously consume fish, because they, you know, don't want to give advice that's inconsistent with their moral or ethical choices, or otherwise, or environmental even. Yep. But I do think it's a good idea. To consume some preformed DHA as a way of, just as an insurance policy. And put it this way, maybe I'm wrong, right? But if we take two people, right, and one's saying some preformed DHA will be good, and the other saying, don't bother, you're fine, you're healthy. Well, in 20 years' time, if I'm wrong, someone's wasted a bit of money on a supplement. If the other person's wrong, well, then someone's increased their risk of an adverse, particularly neurological health outcome. So, you know, whether we measure tissue levels of omega-3s as biomarkers in the blood, whether we look at tissue levels in the brain, which is where DHA is highly concentrated, like I said, all of the data points to some being better than none, and more being better than less. And we don't really have any good evidence that high levels of ALA alone are sufficient to maintain that over the long term. So it's purely an insurance policy, and I could be wrong in 20 years' time, and maybe I am, I don't know. But I think from a population health perspective and from a public health perspective, you need good evidence to deliberately omit any direct sources of a nutrient for which we have evidence of benefit overall. And in the absence of that, then I think the precautionary principle applies. So I'm not arguing that my position is entirely, all I'm arguing for is the precautionary principle should apply here.
I guess one of the other claims that comes up with fish intake is like toxicity levels, pollutants, mercury, these types of discussions. And I'm not sure if you've seen it, but the most recent documentary, Seaspiracy on Netflix, another one that's been, making the rounds.
I don't watch Netflix documentaries about
Hey,
nutrition.
fair enough. Yeah. I kind of wish I
bring
never
myself
watched.
to.
Yeah,
I can't bring myself to. Yeah.
What the health for me.
I've even heard people in the plant-based community say Seaspiracy was awful. It's just George Monbiot on a self-righteous quest, and really just Anyway, so
it's a tricky one because for the average person, when they watch something like that, it's
emotional.
It's emotional, and it gets people. I don't know. It's very easy to just get caught up in it all and get dragged along and not really be able to think too critically about the whole situation.
Sure.
But with documentaries like this coming out, and obviously, again, we have to take into account the environmental side of this whole discussion, and we can look at it from that perspective, and people can make up their own minds in regards to what they're going to consume based on how how we source our food is affecting our planet, and how it's affecting the other sentient beings that inhabits it. But when we look at the pollutant side, mercury side, is this something you would suggest people are looking out for when they're selecting fish into their diet? If they decided, hey, look, I'm going to include some salmon because I want to get that precautionary idea of getting some omega-3s in my diet, are they going to be sabotaging some other area of health via high mercury input or high pollutants?
Yeah. Well, and actually, just to clarify, when I was saying direct source of DHA, like an algae supplement, absolutely fine. That's a good way to go, and it's great that that's now accessible for people. But so on the environmental pollutants, there's one of the main nutrition and brain health researchers who unfortunately passed away last year quite early, Martha Claire Morris from Rush University in Chicago. So she did a number of interesting studies with autopsy brains, and one of which looked at the brains of people who had died healthy and compared them. These were people from a cohort study she was doing in Chicago, and so they'd obviously given consent for the brain to be looked at afterwards. And she also compared them to people who had died from the cohort with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And what was interesting was brain mercury levels were higher in the healthy participants. But those healthy participants also had higher brain levels of omega-3s and also vitamin E. And the take-home point appeared to be that actually you're better off just getting your long-chain omega-3s.
Right.
And vitamin E as well was a big thing that came through in her research.
Okay.
Then worrying about some levels. Now, there are different, particularly, and again, this is something I never have to consider because I live kind of in the Atlantic kind of North Sea kind of area of the world. But I do know that certain Pacific fish, like if you lived in California or I'm maybe in Australia and New Zealand, there's access to these kind of very high mercury fish, like swordfish, for example. Maybe don't go eating huge amounts of that. But in terms of like salmon, mackerel, sardines, and other omega-3 rich fish sources, like I would say it's not even a concern worth worrying about. And you would be better off just getting your oily fish. And the thing about the public health recommendations for oily fish consumption is, one, they're pretty evidence-based based on what we see in kind of long-term studies. But two, it's not that much. It's why, even from an environmental perspective, like the footprint of eating 2 servings of mackerel a week is minimal. And even in the UK off the coast, there's some really good like farmed fishing going on, which the technology for that is getting improved all the time. So anyway, but point being, would someone who is eating 2 servings of oily fish a week worry about mercury? No.
Yeah.
they're getting the benefit of the omega-3s.
Brilliant. Well, I think, look, we've covered some really good ground here, Alan, and I do want to, before I sort of let you go, I want to ask you one sort of final question in regards to diet and human health. And this is one that I still see coming up quite a bit. And you actually mentioned it earlier in regards to IGF-1 and the current sort of idea I see being promoted, and I discussed this a little bit with Eric Helms when he came on, is around leucine intake in our food. And these high doses of leucine, whether from animal products or even if I'm consuming a plant diet where I'm trying to promote muscle growth and I'm enhancing my leucine content through a combination of various proteins. And this effect of high leucine on IGF-1 and increased cancer risk. Is this something you've seen as well? And is this something you have seen any data to support?
I certainly haven't seen any data on it yet. And Eric would be far more well versed in kind of protein metabolism literature than I have. But I've just conversations, like the mechanistic plausibility is, if we're going to make that case that it is this pathway of kind of leucine induced IGF-1, then the idea that couldn't happen just because the sources of protein are plant-based is, to me, illogical. It's if that was the mechanism, if someone was consuming sufficient amounts to trigger that mechanism, well, then it wouldn't really matter necessarily what the diet is, because the mechanism is the potential kind of causal pathway, so to speak.
Yes.
So yeah, but I haven't seen anything I'm also just not sold on this whole worrying about IGF-1 thing. I mean, I would rather, like, in terms of data on longevity, and I'm not talking about the crazy keto, like, longevity stuff where they're like, oh, just don't eat for 5 days and fast and bulletproof coffee and you live to, I'm just genuine longevity, like healthy older populations, health span.
Yes.
I'd rather preserve muscle mass and musculoskeletal integrity and take my bets on that, given everything we know about the detrimental effects of age-related sarcopenia and otherwise. I would rather be, like, muscular and preserved musculoskeletal integrity into my 50s and 60s and take my chances with that and my health than worry about IGF-1 and be a sarcopenic 60-year-old.
Yeah.
So it's just some things we just step back and kind of think more, like, about what do we actually know at a simple level about things that associate with good aging and being healthy and its physical activity and its maintaining musculoskeletal, mass and health. And I don't see how trying to keep IGF-1 low one's whole life is conducive to any of that stuff as far as outcomes.
Yeah, cool. I like that insight. So your take on that. I think, for a lot of, when I'm working with clients or even just talking with people, I always have to remind people that, we're not eating individual, like, amino acids, and we're not eating like individual nutrients, right? We're eating food, and they contain a whole range of these different things. But if we kind of step back, kind of take a little more bird's eye view of our dietary pattern and go, okay, what is the overarching theme here? And just like you were discussing in relation to like the red meat intake, it's like a lot of this is, it's moderation in some sense, but it's also including a fair amount of your plant-based foods as well, and that seems to maybe potentially mediate some of these effects. And so I was looking at that dietary pattern, and so I guess for you, Alan, maybe and I thought this would be kind of cool to hear from you, is like maybe in as few words as possible, what would you suggest is the most well-balanced and nutritionally adequate diet you could recommend to somebody?
Yeah. I just really do think that depends. I think it depends on the needs of the person. I mean, in general, I would say that there's a kind of easy answer of like a diet that obviously covers basis for nutritional adequacy across a range of things that we know to be associated with health: adequate protein, high dietary fiber, more unsaturated fats than saturated, you know, good amount of polyunsaturated fats, a lot of monounsaturated fats, this kind of thing, and from plant and marine sources in terms of poly and monounsaturated fats. And, you know, if we describe diet in terms of those characteristics, then what I like about human nutrition and the varying nature of diets throughout cultures throughout the world is there are a lot of ways to skin that cat in terms of food choice. So I'm kind of always loath to fill in the detail about the food choices, because if those characteristics are present, well, then I think there are a lot of ways to meet it with different food choices. You know, and then with diets that are kind of exclusive, you know, like a fully vegan diet, are there some additional considerations? Yes, absolutely. I think even with the recent a couple of fracture studies, like, it's a good idea for vegans to supplement with calcium and vitamin D. It looks like it probably is for bone health right now. Is it a good idea to supplement with a direct source of EPA and DHA? Well, we don't have that data the way we do with calcium and vitamin D in bones, but it might be a precautionary principle. But otherwise, is there anything that vegan diets, obviously B12, I think is just accepted. Right. Is there anything else that needs really filling? Like, I'm not convinced that there's really any other nutrient on a vegan diet. Otherwise, you'll always see people talk about like zinc and stuff. Like, nah, yes. I don't think any of those are nutrients of kind of interest. You know, for people eating omnivorous diets, like, there's often this tendency to just kind of conflate the standard Western diet,
yes,
with, like, you know, a diet that is inclusive of meat. You know, and I got my parents live in the south of Spain, you know, and if I go down there and I see that diet by the coast, and like just the fish, and yeah, there's cured meat and stuff, but like just the richness of the color in the diet and the, you know, the amount of vegetable, like, it's such a great, what a dietary pattern, you know. It's lovely.
Yes.
So I think there are a lot of ways to meet those nutritional characteristics. And right now, are the environmental considerations important? Yes, absolutely. You know, so, but there are, for people that do have the capacity, I think there are ways, you know, now to make the transition smoother. I mean, some of the plant meat alternatives are really good. You know, and, you know, I think whether the decision for someone including some meat or no meat, or some dairy or no dairy, or some fish or no fish, I would rather that be based on a decision that's congruent with their moral ethic and perhaps environmental considerations, and also the health considerations. But I'd rather that the evaluation of the health consideration be more objective than it is now, as between both the plant-based and the kind of like extreme low carb kind of carnivore communities, neither of which are, I think, very helpful to what just your average Joe in the population is trying to do to improve their diet and their health.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a brilliant way to wrap this one up, Alan. So thank you so much for your time here and for giving us so much insight, man. It's been brilliant. I want to give you that opportunity to plug anything that you want to plug, maybe the work you're doing at the moment or what you've going on in the coming months. Let us know.
Yeah, so I mean, you can kind of find me online on Instagram. Really is the only social media account I have, at the nutritional_advocate. You can find me at my own website, which is alineanutrition.com. And then you can also find me on Sigma Nutrition, where, as you said earlier, producing these statements on various questions, and Danny and myself record a couple of podcasts every month, and we drip them out every second week or so. So yeah, there's hopefully enough there for me to haunt people with.
I have to say, I do really enjoy those episodes of you and Danny, and even just, you know, the little segments, the Quack Asylum, and, you know,
the Quack Asylum's so good.
These are fun. So I think it's a great addition to the podcast. And definitely keep those ones coming, man.
We will indeed.
Brilliant, man. Hey, well, I'll let you get out of here. Thanks so much for coming on again. And we will speak again soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jackson. Thanks for having me.
So, I don't actually know how to summarize this thing because there's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of nuance. And even if you don't take anything incredibly scientific away from this discussion, I hope that it just opened your eyes to the idea that we can't make blanket one-size-fits-all statements around human health and nutrition science. If I was trying to summarize this thing, when we look at red meat, there seems to be a dose threshold of consistent intakes over 160 grams per day, increasing risk of disease. But intakes of under 100 grams per day with high amounts of vegetables and fruit may not increase risk. And we can't forget the impact that high saturated fat content animal foods, such as your fatty meats, fatty red meats, the impact that they have on increased LDL cholesterol and increased cardiovascular disease risk. And this is all exacerbated by low intakes of fruit, vegetables, and fiber. So if you or someone you know is consuming red meat in quantities above 160 grams per day without adequate fruit and vegetable intake, you could potentially suggest that they aim to reduce that slightly and encourage a diet that is adequate in whole grains, fruits, nuts, vegetables, etc. When it comes to dairy, it's incredibly nuanced. There's reliable reduced risk of colorectal cancer with dairy products such as cheese and yogurt. There is mixed data on breast cancer, but often it's in favor of risk reduction. And when it comes to prostate cancer, it is a slight potential increase of risk there. When we look at antibiotics and hormones in milks, it's essentially undetectable as far as human effects go. Just because something is present, it does not mean it's having an effect. So I don't think we have to be incredibly worried about the hormonal effects of the milk we're consuming. However, of course, there are huge implications of the animal welfare and environmental costs of dairy production. And I think for that reason alone, avoiding or reducing dairy as much as possible in your diet is an absolute must. One cool thing that we did touch on, and Alan gave some great insight on, is dairy and acne. It seems that there are some associations between dairy and acne, and it's often compounded by the effects of high whey protein consumption. So if you or someone you know is suffering with high amounts of acne, potentially suggest them reducing their dairy intake, or if they are consuming a lot of whey protein, they might just switch to a plant protein source. When it comes to including fish in our diet, there doesn't seem to be any real benefits of including fish outside of the benefits of the omega-3 content of the fish. So if you can get a preformed DHA in a supplement such as algae, and that is within your budget, that is definitely a good option as a bit of a insurance policy for yourself. If budget is a little bit tight and you can't afford to go out and get a preformed algae DHA supplement, I do suggest consuming as much ALA as you can in the form of chia seed, ground flaxseed, walnuts, hemp seeds, things like that, just to get yourself in the ballpark and optimize that conversion from ALA to DHA and EPA. And lastly, when it comes to the effects of high protein intakes and specifically high leucine intakes and its effects on IGF-1 and potential cancer risk, I think the takeaway there is, as Alan alluded to, the data isn't super clear on this, and it's potentially better to preserve muscle mass and skeletal integrity well into your elderly years than worry about a not conclusive IGF-1 mechanism of increasing cancer risk. And I definitely agree with that. I would much prefer to be a 60-plus-year-old that is strong, fit, and healthy and able to do the things that I want to do than be struggling with sarcopenia, reduced bone mineral density, fractures, falls, things like this, and not be able to live the life that I'm living. But at the same time, that's just me, and I guess we'll wait for more data to come out around leucine and its effects on IGF-1, and if that mechanism really is something we need to be worried about. So I'm assuming most of you are already following a plant-predominant or plant-exclusive diet anyway, so this episode isn't likely going to convince you to start consuming any animal products, and that wasn't the goal from the outset. But I hope you can take away the level of nuance that goes into nutritional research and understanding that not all big shots in the plant-based community have it all together. We're all trying to assess the data from our own perspectives, and some of us may have bias, some of us may have invested interests in these different subjects, and we have to be aware of that when we are looking at nutritional science. So I'm going to leave it there. We're not going to go any further. If you want to dive into some more data, feel free to check out Alan's stuff. I'll link all his links in the description as well, so you can keep up to date with him and the incredible content he does put out. If you want to get in contact with me, hit me up on Instagram. I'd love to see you share this one on your stories. And of course, check out the brand new Vegan Body Coach website, where you can check out all the coaching that I do and what I don't do, and if it's going to be the right fit for you. So guys, we'll leave it there, and we'll catch you in the next one. Go eat up, go lift up, and get some more plants.